Europa stands on the brink of war. Rising tensions between the various great powers of the continent threaten to shatter the peace long enjoyed these last decades. A rapidly arming Saxony Empire has begun to pressure its neighbors with increasing mobilization along its borders. In response, both the Republic of Polania and the proud Nordic kingdoms have each begun to raise armies themselves, and not a moment too soon. To the east, the Soviet Union has made overtures to war, threatening both the impoverished Crimean Khanate to the south, as well as Polania to the west. It is in this time of hostility and rising tension that our story continues, with the deadly plot and its dire consequences. In 1910, the Tsar of the Soviet Union narrowly survived an assassination attempt. The assassin escaped, but Grigory Rasputin, the Tsar's trusted advisor, claimed to have seen the accused and sent his men to track him down. Several days later, Rasputin produced a body bearing documents with the seal of the Republic of Polania and said that the man had confessed to the assassination attempt before being executed. Polania denied these vile and baseless accusations. Outrage at the attack and the brazen denial grew within the Union, until only a few weeks later, Soviet soldiers shot and killed several Polanian engineers in the vicinity of the factory. The Republic of Polania bristled at this violation, and before long, militias were instigating skirmishes between the two nations as people cried out for vengeance. Europa had reached its tipping point. Flush with nearly a decade of prosperity, and eager to test the might of its newly assembled war machines, it took nearly no time at all for all of these isolated skirmishes to transform into total war. Saxony, seizing on the opportunity afforded to them by a distracted Polania, sent its mechanized armies charging eastward in a full-scale blitzkrieg assault, led by Gunther von Duisburg and his two direwolf companions. Elite mech squads steamed across the forests and mountains of Saxony before plunging into Polania. Gunther's name was both feared and respected even before the war, and his jacket grew heavy with medals of honor as the war continued. Polania answered this onslaught with guerrilla attacks and fighting retreats, which quickly bogged down Saxony Empire forces. This effort was greatly helped by Anna Koss and her powerful bear Wojtek. The two of them traveled across much of Europa as the war waged, becoming living legends as they distinguished themselves in battle and by offering humanitarian aid. Without Anna and Wojtek, it is likely that the Republic would have capitulated within months of the Saxony assault. However, thanks to her actions, Polania was able to redeploy its forces in time, halting Gunther's advance. Meanwhile, the Crimean Khanate, not content to simply wait and be conquered by a belligerent Soviet Union, began to push into Union territory from the south, even as the Nordic kingdoms began to do the same from the north. This left the Union fighting on three fronts, forcing them to withdraw soldiers from their border with Polania. Now, every great power in Eastern Europa was embroiled in the conflict, and the Great War had begun. While the early action of the Great War may have seemed glorious and distinguished, no one was prepared for war on an industrial scale. In their eagerness to experiment with the new weapons and tactics, Europa's generals did not consider the scope or consequences of their actions. In the opening months of the war, all the people saw were images of heroics and triumphs. But as the offensive slowed, and many nations found themselves locked in bitter stalemates, opinions began to change. The new weapons were spectacular, awe-inspiring, and utterly horrifying. The mechs caused a destruction that the mind could not fathom, and by the time Europa had come to terms with the new capabilities of these war machines, every nation was so afraid of the terrific powers of their enemies that they could not stop using their own. So the war dragged on, year after bloody year. Death tolls registered in the tens of thousands, then the hundreds of thousands. And as this continued, it became clear to all the situation was untenable. The deadlock had to be broken, or the carnage would just never end. In response to this, the Rusviet Tsar ordered the factory to be seized in an attempt at claiming new, potentially war-winning technologies that might be sequestered away there. The Union armies were hopelessly outgunned by the factory's more advanced automachines, and eventually they were forced to retreat. However, they did capture several engineers bound for Tesla's city-state, including the nephew of the Togawa Shogun. In response, the shogun sent his niece, Akiko, at the head of a large military expedition to subvert the Rusviets and to recover the kidnapped engineers. The Togawa expedition was a far greater success than anyone expected. The Rusviet Union, already destabilized from years of war, collapsed under the pressure Akiko placed on it, and was forced to withdraw from the Great War in shambles. At the same time, drawn in by Saxony aggression against their longtime allies, the Clan Albion entered the war, intent on preventing further atrocities. Led by the Highlander Connor, the Albion armies smashed against the northern border of Saxony, greatly weakening the Empire's position. Sabotage efforts behind Saxony lines by Connor were met with stunning success, disrupting Empire supply lines and forcing Saxony to retreat from Polania. Regardless of these disruptions, however, the Great War continued. Year after year, miles of trenches were dug, millions of men died, thousands of automachines were built, and the powers of Europa strained closer and closer to their breaking point. As the spring of 1916 gave way to an early summer, the war efforts escalated once again. This time, though, there was a sense of finality. Without having to fight the Rusviets in the east, the great powers of Europa believed the end was near. The people, the soldiers and the leaders were all tired of this war. The major players limped through the summer of 1916, mustering the remnants of their forces and steeling themselves for the war's climax. Then, as though in response to some unseen signal, they all heaved forth in one final, violent outburst that was the Great War's death rattle. When the oily smoke cleared, only desolation remained, and the survivors crawled home, listless and broken. The Great War had crippled every nation involved. Bereft and exhausted, the public met the end of the war with stunned and cautious relief. In the first few weeks of the ceasefire, most expected hostilities to reignite at any moment. Gradually, though, they became more comfortable and even hopeful. Then, a few weeks after the fighting ceased, formal truces were announced between several of the nations. For now it seemed the rulers and politicians had had their fill of war, and the citizens of the nations were all too happy to begin the rebuilding effort. However, military leaders had not forgotten the lessons they had learned, and the new technologies developed during the Great War would not simply sit in the armories gathering dust. From the outset, Tesla had known that his machines had the potential for death and destruction, but in his eagerness to test his inventions and to finally be seen as the genius he was, he never truly considered the devastating potential of his designs. In his mind, The machine's capacity for destruction had been theoretical at best. It was clear that he had never imagined these industrial war machines would be pitted against human flesh. But his mechs were used in battle, though they never replaced soldier and cavalry. They supplemented them, and they overpowered them. Tesla did not entirely believe the early reports from his ambassadors regarding the destruction being wrought by his auto machines. After all, who would send soldiers into battle alongside these behemoths? Were they madmen? Early reports had told of scores of soldiers slaughtered in mere moments. As the years wore on, tactics adapted, but it was rare for infantry or cavalry to survive more than a few battles where mechs were involved. However, it was the civilian casualties that pushed Tesla over the edge. The armies had shown little discretion in applying their new machines of death, and there were unending reports of farms targeted for attack or villagers simply getting caught in the crossfire. Eventually, Tesla had to see for himself, and he left his work and his factory and toured the countryside. There, he saw bodies everywhere. Soldiers, horses, farmers, families, children. And he realized that these were only the ones that had not yet been retrieved. They were lying in fields, ditches, streams, barns, and houses. He reeled. Some say he went mad. Whatever the case, he retreated into the factory, ceasing all manufacturing and dismissing his workers. He took his daughter and disappeared behind the closed factory doors.